Hello, and welcome. Thank you for joining me here, in this quiet space as we prepare to drift back through the centuries. There's no need to do anything now, nothing at all, except to find a comfortable position, to feel the support beneath you, and to allow your body to grow heavy and still. Take a gentle, slow breath in, and as you exhale, feel the concerns of the day begin to soften, to recede into the distance like ripples on a calm lake. Tonight, our journey takes us to the late 14th century. It is a world lit by fire and candle, a world of stone castles and whispered politics, where the lives of individuals, especially those of royal birth, were woven into the grand and often unforgiving tapestry of history. We are not here to witness great battles or to untangle the loud, dramatic knots of the past. Instead, we are here to trace the quiet footsteps of a single life, a life that began in the highest echelons of power, yet was defined by a profound and gentle tragedy. Our story is that of Isabella of Valois, a princess of France and, for a brief time, a queen of England. She was a child who carried the weight of kingdoms on her small shoulders. Her story is not one of grandeur and triumph, but one of duty, resilience, and quiet endurance. So, let your mind relax. Let the sounds around you fade away, replaced only by the sound of my voice. And let us begin our journey as we drift back to the court of medieval France and to the birth of a child queen. Our story begins in Paris in the year 1389. The great city is a labyrinth of winding streets, timber-framed houses, and the rising spires of cathedrals that scrape against the gray sky. At its heart stands the Louvre Palace, not yet the museum we know today, but a formidable royal fortress, its cold stone walls a symbol of the power of the French crown. Within these walls, on the 6th of November, a daughter is born to King Charles VI and his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. They name her Isabella. The air in the royal chambers is thick with the scent of beeswax candles and dried herbs, meant to purify the air and ward off ill health. The sounds are muted. The rustle of heavy velvet gowns, the distant rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer from the city below, the soft murmur of ladies-in-waiting. Isabella's birth is a significant event, another link in the chain of the Valois dynasty. Her father, King Charles, is known to his people as Charles the Beloved. At this point in his reign, he is a capable and chivalrous king. But even now, there are whispers of a fragility about him, a shadow that will later lengthen into periods of profound mental distress, leaving the governance of his kingdom in a state of quiet uncertainty. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, is a formidable figure, pragmatic and politically astute. She understands that her children, especially her daughters, are not simply children. They are political assets, precious pieces in the intricate game of European diplomacy. From her earliest moments, Isabella's life is not truly her own. It belongs to the crown of France. Imagine yourself as a silent observer in these early years of Isabella's life. Her world is a gilded cage, beautiful and secure, but a cage nonetheless. Her days unfold with the predictable rhythm of a monastery bell. She does not run freely through fields or play simple games in the dirt. Instead, her hours are meticulously structured. Her mornings are for lessons. Tutors instruct her in Latin and French, in history and scripture. Her small fingers learn to guide a needle, creating intricate patterns of silk thread on fine linen, a skill expected of a high-born lady. Her afternoons are spent learning the delicate art of courtly life. She learns how to walk, how to sit, how to curtsy with the perfect blend of humility and grace. She learns the complex heraldry of 100 noble families, memorizing the alliances and rivalries that shimmer just beneath the surface of courtly politeness. The sounds of her childhood are not of laughter and shouting, but of the soft plucking of a lute, the gentle cadence of a recited poem, the rustle of turning pages in an illuminated manuscript. The textures are of cool silk, heavy brocade, and the smooth polished wood of her chair. It is a life of immense privilege, surrounded by beauty, yet devoid of the simple freedom that a common child might take for granted. She is perpetually watched, guided, and shaped for a purpose she is still too young to understand. This purpose is dictated by the great, overarching conflict of the age, the long and wearying struggle between England and France that history would come to call the 100 Years' War. At the time of Isabella's childhood, the war is in a period of relative calm, a fragile truce, but it is not a true peace. It is more like a long, held breath, a tense pause in a conflict that has shaped the lives of generations. Across the Channel, England is ruled by King Richard II. Richard is a complex man. He is a lover of art, music, and refinement, a king who prefers the velvet glove to the iron fist. He had deeply loved his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, and her death left him in a state of profound grief. But he is also a king who understands the need for stability. The long war with France has drained England's treasury and its spirit. Richard desires a lasting peace, a true settlement that will allow both kingdoms to heal. And so, the quiet machinery of diplomacy begins to turn. Envoys travel back and forth across the English Channel, their ships cutting through the gray, choppy waters. In candlelit rooms, letters are written with quill pens, the wax seals bearing the lions of England and the fleur-de-lis of France. The subject of these discussions is a marriage to seal a new 28-year truce, a marriage between the 29-year-old King of England and a French princess. The chosen bride is the daughter of the King of France, the young Isabella. The fact that she is only 6 years old is a point of discussion, but not a barrier. In the cold calculus of statecraft, her age is a practical matter to be managed, not a reason to halt the arrangement. It is decided that the marriage will be official, but it will not be consummated until she is of a suitable age when she is 12 years old. Until then, she will be Queen of England in name, a living symbol of this new accord. We can only imagine how this news was presented to the little girl. Perhaps she was brought into a grand chamber, the soaring tapestries on the walls depicting ancient heroes and forgotten battles. Her parents, the king and queen, would have sat before her, their faces serious. Noblemen and advisers would have stood in the shadows, their expressions unreadable. They would have told her of her great destiny, of her duty to France, of the peace she would bring to two great kingdoms. They would have called her noble and brave. To a child of 6, these words, destiny, duty, peace, are merely sounds, abstract concepts with no real meaning. What she would have understood was the weight of their gaze, the finality in their tone. She would have understood that her life was about to change, that the familiar rhythms of her childhood were coming to an end. She was no longer just Isabella of Valois, a princess of France. She was to become Isabella, Queen of England, a small, precious jewel, carefully polished and prepared, to be sent across the sea and set in a foreign crown. The treaty is signed. The dowry is agreed upon. The path of her life, once a quiet stream within the palace walls, now merges with the great, powerful river of history, which will carry her far from home. And so, the chapter of her French childhood draws to a close, not with an ending, but with a new and daunting beginning just on the horizon. In the months that followed the agreement, the Louvre Palace was filled with a quiet, purposeful activity. Isabella's departure was being prepared. This was not the hurried packing of a normal journey, but a stately and meticulous process, a royal trousseau being assembled piece by piece. Seamstresses worked by the light of tall windows, their needles flashing as they stitched gowns of velvet and silk in deep jewel tones. Jewelers set precious stones into crowns and necklaces, each one a testament to the wealth of the French monarchy. Scribes copied and illuminated books for her personal library. There were chests filled with fine linens, with silver plates and goblets, with everything a queen might require to establish her new household. It was a dowry of immense value, a collection of objects that spoke of status and power, but there was little among them that spoke to the simple heart of a 6-year-old child. Finally, the day of departure arrived. It was late October in the year 1396. A long procession of carriages and knights assembled in the courtyard of the palace. Isabella was dressed in a gown befitting her new station, her small frame lost in the opulent fabric. She bid farewell to her mother and her siblings, a formal and restrained parting, as was the custom of the time. Public displays of deep emotion were not encouraged in the royal court. Her duty required composure. The journey north, towards the coast, was slow and deliberate. The heavy wheels of her carriage churned the muddy autumn roads. For Isabella, peering through the window, it was a world in motion. She saw the French countryside unfolding like a tapestry, fields lying fallow after the harvest, the last golden leaves clinging to the trees, and the thin plumes of wood smoke rising from the thatched roofs of distant villages. The rhythm of the journey was steady, hypnotic. The creak of the leather harnesses, the jingle of the horses' bridles, the rhythmic clatter of 50 hooves on the road. At night, they would stop at castles or fortified manors, where she would be greeted with solemn ceremony, a guest of honor who was also a symbol of a fragile new peace. For a child, these days must have been a strange dream, a blur of new faces and new places, all leading her further and further from the only world she had ever known. Her destination was a place near Calais, a stretch of land under English control. Here, a magnificent temporary town of pavilions and tents had been erected. It was a neutral ground, a stage for the final formal act of her transfer. On one side flew the golden fleur-de-lis of France, on the other the lions of England. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of the nearby sea and the damp earth. Here, King Charles VI of France and King Richard II of England met. The two monarchs, surrounded by their most powerful nobles, rode to the center of the field. They dismounted and embraced, a public performance of friendship and alliance. Charles, on this day, was lucid and regal, the shadows in his mind having receded for a time. Richard was tall and fair, dressed with the impeccable taste for which he was known. They exchanged gifts and pleasantries, their voices calm and measured, but beneath the pageantry lay the weight of a century of conflict. And then it was time. Isabella was led forward by her governess. She was a tiny, solitary figure in the midst of all this power and ceremony. King Richard approached her, and instead of greeting her as a monarch, he greeted her as a child. He knelt down on one knee so that his eyes were level with hers. He had a kind face, and he spoke to her gently in French, his voice soft and reassuring. Isabella, who had been coached for weeks for this moment, responded with a poise that astonished the onlookers. She replied clearly that she was pleased to be the Queen of England. It was a line she had memorized, a part she had learned to play. But in that moment, in the genuine kindness of the English king, a small seed of trust was planted. She was a political pawn, yes, but she had been handed from one king to another who, at the very least, saw the child before him. The formal handover was complete. Isabella left her father's pavilion and entered the English camp. A new life had begun. The next stage of her journey was the sea. She was carried aboard a large wooden ship, its sails painted with the English coat of arms. For a child who had never seen the ocean, the experience would have been overwhelming. The endless expanse of gray-green water, the cries of the gulls circling overhead, the constant rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers, and the taste of salt on the air. As the coast of France faded into a thin, misty line on the horizon, her last link to her old life disappeared. She arrived in England to great fanfare and was soon taken to London to be crowned. The ceremony took place in Westminster Abbey, a cavernous space of soaring stone pillars and breathtaking stained glass. Imagine the scene from her perspective. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and melting wax, the sound of a choir of monks, their voices echoing in the vast hall, was a thunderous, unearthly noise. She was dressed in heavy coronation robes, and a crown, too large and heavy for her head, was gently placed upon her hair. She sat on a throne, her feet barely touching the floor, a small, still point in a swirling vortex of ritual. She saw a sea of faces looking up at her, the lords and ladies of England, her new subjects, all of them strangers. It was a grand and glorious pageant, but for the child at its center, it must have been a profoundly lonely and bewildering experience. After the coronation, her new life took on a quiet rhythm. She was given her own royal household, primarily at Windsor Castle, its massive stone towers overlooking the gentle English countryside. Her days were once again structured but different. She was surrounded by English ladies-in-waiting, kind women chosen by the king, but their language and customs were new and strange. King Richard was a constant, gentle presence in her life. He did not treat her as a wife, but as a cherished ward, a daughter figure. He would visit her often, sitting with her and her ladies. He brought her gifts, a small dog, a finely crafted doll. They would speak together, he in his careful French, she in her formal, learned replies. He seemed to find a measure of peace in her innocent company, a respite from the political pressures that were slowly mounting around him. For Isabella, this gentle, attentive man was her protector, the one point of familiarity and comfort in this strange new land. And so, the child queen settled into her role. She was learning a new language, new customs, a new way of life. She was the Queen of England, a symbol of peace living a quiet, protected life in a royal castle. The great, turbulent currents of history that had carried her here seemed to have subsided, leaving her in a calm and peaceful harbor. For now, for a few short years, this gentle rhythm of life continued. Isabella grew from a small child into a young girl. Her French slowly softened with the cadence of English, and the faces around her became familiar and comforting. Windsor, with its sprawling grounds and ancient stone walls, became her home. The bond between her and King Richard deepened, settling into a comfortable and affectionate relationship, akin to that of a doting uncle and his niece. But outside the sheltered walls of Isabella's household, the political climate of England was growing colder, the skies darkening with an approaching storm. King Richard's reign, which he had hoped to define by peace and culture, was becoming increasingly troubled. The great nobles of the realm, men who had grown powerful during the long years of war, were restless. They saw Richard's desire for peace with France not as a wise policy, but as a weakness. They chafed at his reliance on a small circle of trusted advisers, and they resented the taxes he levied to fund his lavish court. They were men of war, whose identities and fortunes were built on the battlefield, and they grew quiet and discontented in this new era of diplomacy. This discontent was a low, rumbling thunder on the horizon of Isabella's world. She would not have understood the complex details of land disputes, of royal prerogatives, or of parliamentary grants. But she would have sensed the change in atmosphere. She might have noticed the worried expressions on the faces of her ladies-in-waiting, the hushed, urgent conversations in hallways that would cease the moment she entered the room. She might have observed that King Richard's visits became less frequent, his gentle demeanor now tinged with a weariness, a shadow of anxiety in his eyes. The most powerful of Richard E.'s opponents was a man who should have been one of his closest allies, his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Henry was a charismatic and ambitious man, a stark contrast to the refined and artistic Richard. Where Richard was a peacemaker, Henry was a celebrated warrior. He was popular with the people and respected by the other nobles. A bitter dispute between Henry and another powerful duke led King Richard to make a fateful decision. He banished them both from the kingdom. This act, meant to secure his power, only served to deepen the resentment against him. A short time later, Henry's father, the immensely wealthy and powerful John of Gaunt, passed away. By all rights, his vast fortune and lands should have passed to his exiled son, Henry. But Richard, desperate for funds and seeking to cripple his cousin's power for good, made another critical error. He seized the entire inheritance for the crown. This was a step too far. It was a violation of the sacred laws of inheritance that underpinned the entire noble class. If the king could disinherit his own cousin, then no nobleman's property was safe. The quiet discontent among the lords now had a cause to rally around. It had a leader. In the summer of 1399, while King Richard was away on a military campaign in Ireland, the storm finally broke. Henry Bolingbroke, defying his exile, landed on the coast of England. He claimed he had only returned to reclaim his rightful inheritance, but he was met by a growing army of discontented nobles who flocked to his banner. The movement quickly grew from a quest for personal justice into a full-blown rebellion against the king. For Isabella, now nearly 10 years old, this was the moment her gilded cage was shattered. As news of Henry's invasion spread, a panic rippled through the royal court. Loyalty, once a solid foundation, became a shifting sand. Men who had sworn allegiance to Richard now began to calculate their chances and quietly slip away to join the challenger. Isabella was quickly moved from the familiar comfort of Windsor to the more fortified Wallingford Castle. Her world, once so predictable and secure, was suddenly thrown into chaos and uncertainty. Her trusted ladies and attendants were dismissed, replaced by guards and keepers loyal to the new rising power. Her connection to King Richard was severed. She was now a captive, a valuable chess piece in a new and dangerous game. Imagine the fear and confusion of a child in this situation. The gentle routines were gone. The kind faces were replaced by those of strangers. The soft sounds of her court were replaced by the clang of armor and the anxious murmurings of guards. She was a queen, but she was powerless. She was a symbol of peace with France, but the country she was meant to rule was tearing itself apart. King Richard returned from Ireland to find his kingdom lost. His support had evaporated. His army deserted him. After a tense period of maneuvering, he was captured and taken to the Tower of London, that grim fortress on the banks of the River Thames. In a somber ceremony in Parliament, Richard II, the king who had knelt to greet a 6-year-old child with such gentleness, was forced to abdicate the throne. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, was crowned King Henry IV. The news would have reached Isabella in her isolation. The man she had known as her husband, her king, and her protector was now a prisoner. A stranger, a man who had led a rebellion, now sat on the throne. Her status as Queen of England was gone in an instant. She was now the widow of a deposed king, a foreign princess in a land whose politics had turned violent and unpredictable. The French court was outraged. The truce, sealed by her marriage, was broken. Her father, King Charles, slipping deeper into his periods of madness, was unable to mount a meaningful response. The French nobles demanded her safe return, along with her dowry. But the new King Henry was not so willing to let her go. She was still a valuable asset. There was talk of marrying her to his own son, the young Prince Henry, the future Henry V, as a way to maintain the French connection and legitimize his own new dynasty. And so, Isabella remained in England, a queen without a crown, a widow whose husband was still alive, trapped in a state of terrifying limbo. The gentle, peaceful world that had been carefully constructed around her had been completely dismantled, leaving her exposed to the cold, harsh winds of political reality. The quiet years were over. The tragedy of her young life was about to enter its most painful chapter. The months following King Richard's abdication were a period of quiet and profound uncertainty for Isabella. She was now officially styled the Dowager Queen, a title for a king's widow. Yet the king she was meant to be mourning was still alive. A prisoner in the cold, remote walls of Pontefract Castle in the north, she remained in England, treated with the formal respect due to her rank, but she was a prisoner nonetheless. King Henry IV saw to it that she lived in comfort, but the warmth and affection of Richard's court were gone, replaced by a cool, political courtesy. She was a constant, living reminder of the king he had deposed, a French princess whose future was a diplomatic problem he now had to solve. Then, in the early weeks of the year 1400, the final, somber news arrived. A delegation of noblemen, their faces grave, formally informed her that Richard II had passed away in his prison. No details were offered of the manner of his passing. The event was shrouded in the grim ambiguity that so often accompanies the fall of a monarch. For Isabella, now just 10 years old, the news was a source of genuine grief. Richard had been her husband in name only, but he had been her guardian, her protector, and her only true friend in a foreign land. She now mourned him not as a political figure, but as the one who had knelt to her level, who had spoken to her with kindness, who had made her gilded cage feel, for a time, like a home. She entered a period of formal mourning, her small figure clad in black, her demeanor marked by a quiet and solemn dignity that belied her young age. With Richard officially gone, King Henry moved to the next stage of his plan. He proposed that Isabella should be married to his own son and heir, the young Prince of Wales, a boy who would one day become the famous King Henry V. From a political standpoint, the match was perfect. It would preserve the alliance with France, secure the legitimacy of the new Lancastrian dynasty, and keep Isabella and her valuable connections firmly within English control. The proposal was made to her with all the gentle persuasion that diplomacy could muster, and it was here, for the first time in her young life, that Isabella demonstrated an unshakable will of her own. She refused. Her refusal was not a hysterical outburst or a fit of childish defiance. It was a calm, steady, and unmovable resolve. She was the loyal queen of King Richard, and she would not marry the son of the man who had taken his throne. She cloaked her refusal in the propriety of her deep mourning, a position that was difficult for the new court to argue against. Day after day, week after week, she was gently pressured, and day after day, week after week, she quietly and respectfully refused. Her loyalty to Richard's memory had become her anchor in a world of shifting allegiances. Her steadfast refusal created a stalemate. If she would not marry his son, then she was of little use to King Henry. The pressure from France for her return intensified, but the negotiations dragged on for more than a year, snagged on the contentious issue of her dowry. Henry, his new reign financially unstable, was unwilling to return the vast treasure that had accompanied her to England. For Isabella, this was another period of waiting, of living a life in limbo. She was moved from residence to residence, from Sunninghill to Havering-atte-Bower, always comfortable, always watched, as the slow, tedious work of diplomacy unfolded in letters and envoys sent back and forth across the sea. Finally, in the summer of 1401, an agreement was reached. Isabella would be allowed to return to her homeland, but her jewels and her dowry would remain in England. It was a bitter compromise for the French, but their desire to have their princess back outweighed their claims to her fortune. And so, Isabella began her journey home. It was the reverse of the one she had made 5 years earlier. The same slow procession through the English countryside, the same gray waters of the Channel, the same sight of the French coast slowly growing clearer on the horizon. But she was not the same person. She had left France as a hopeful 6-year-old child, a symbol of peace, destined to be a queen. She returned as a 12-year-old widow, a pawn in a broken treaty, her heart carrying a quiet weight of loss and experience far beyond her years. Her return to the French court was not a simple homecoming. The court itself was more fractured than when she had left, with her father's illness now a permanent feature of life, and the powerful Dukes of Burgundy and Orléans vying for control of the kingdom. She was welcomed, but she was once again a piece on the political board. For several years, she lived a quiet life, resuming her place among the royal children. Then, in 1406, another marriage was arranged for her. She was now 16, and she was wed to her cousin, Charles, the young Duke of Orléans. He was only 11 at the time, but he was known for his gentle nature and his love of poetry. By all accounts, this second marriage was a genuinely happy one. In the young Duke, Isabella found a kind and affectionate companion. After the trauma and uncertainty of her English years, this period of her life was one of relative peace and contentment, a brief, warm season of personal happiness. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1409, Isabella gave birth to a daughter whom they named Joan, but the joy of motherhood was tragically brief. Complications from the birth took their toll, and shortly afterward Isabella's life came to a quiet close. She was not yet 20 years old. Her short life, which began with such grand political purpose, had ended in the quiet, intimate tragedy of the childbed, a fate so common for women of her era, regardless of their rank. She had been a princess of France, a queen of England, a political prisoner, a dowager, and finally a contented duchess. She had weathered the fall of a king and the shifting tides of history with a quiet, resilient grace. Her story, often just a footnote in the grand narrative of kings and battles, was complete. And so, the story of Isabella of Valois comes to its gentle end. We have walked with her in the quiet corridors of her life, from the gilded cage of the French court, across the gray sea to a foreign throne, and through the shadows of a fallen king. Her life was a brief candle, lit in a time of great ceremony and great uncertainty. She was a daughter, a queen, a widow, and a wife, a series of titles that defined her existence, roles she was born to play on the vast stage of history. Her story is a quiet reminder of the countless lives, especially those of women, that were lived not for themselves, but for duty, for the forging of alliances and the sealing of treaties, lives of quiet endurance, of resilience in the face of forces far beyond their control. These are the threads that are so often lost in the grand, sweeping tapestry of the past, but they are what give it its true, human texture. Now, let the echoes of this distant world begin to fade. Let the stone walls of Windsor and the Louvre dissolve into memory. The struggles and sorrows of the 14th century belong to a time long, long ago. Here, now, you are safe. You are comfortable. You are in a world of softness and warmth, far removed from the cold drafts and political whispers of the past. There is nothing more required of you, nothing to solve, nothing to understand. The story is over. You can let it drift away, like a boat sailing out towards a misty horizon, until it disappears from view. Allow your mind to become still, as calm and quiet as a moonlit garden. Feel the gentle weight of sleep beginning to settle over you, a soft, warm blanket for your mind and your body. Every breath you take now draws you deeper into rest, deeper into peace. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. May your rest be deep and untroubled. May your dreams be sweet. Sleep well.